Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome aboard the beautiful Silver Spirit. I'm Richard Heyman, who uh, is your destination speaker to introduce you to some of the ports and sites that we're going to be visiting on this great trip to the far north. Many of you may have been to Scandinavia, Sweden, Denmark, Norway before, but I have many times, but there's always more to discover. This is such a beautiful part of the world, especially this time of year. And we are going first from Copenhagen, which I hope you enjoyed, to Gothenburg, which is the large Swedish city on the west coast facing the North Sea and was traditionally the maritime port for the ships of Sweden that would go around the world and trade, and to this day has a very strong maritime tradition and a large industrial sector too. So many of the products that you associate with Sweden come from Gothenburg. But in Swedish, the name is Göteborg, rather than what we use in English is actually the German name Gothenburg. But it's actually named after the original inhabitants called the Goths, and we have that name, comes down to us even in the word Gothic, if you know anybody like that. And but if you see Sweden, it's really quite a remarkable country because it's very long and has a very far north, some high mountains up in the north where the border with Norway is, and then it borders with Finland and has most of its coast on the Baltic Sea with a number of different islands. And then down there where we've embarked in Copenhagen, that is a very close to the southern tip of Sweden, an area called Skåne, which has good farming and also forests and hills and a lot of upland. And then there are these very large lakes in southern Sweden, which are almost like an inland sea. Well, where we are, coming from Denmark, going up the Kattegat, literally the cat's gut to the Skagerrak. Means the whirlpools. This is a very rough water around here, and Gothenburg is just on the right of the map in the middle area. That's the Swedish name, Göteborg, and then we'll be sailing up around the bays of Oslo, and then we'll be continuing on our way up to the great north part of Norway. But just this part of Sweden is sort of a world unto itself. It's so far away from the very far frozen Arctic area that this has most of the population between Stockholm area and then Gothenburg area, and then the southern warmer parts of Sweden. The ship had previously sailed out of Stockholm all the way around the Baltic and came up to Denmark. But a lot of this area has rocky shores because this was sort of scraped over by the ice age. Literally, there are big markings in the land of where the ice was, and then it retreated, leaving flooded valleys that are now a little bit of islands that are rocky and somewhat treacherous if you don't know where you're going in a boat. Of course, we're out in the major sea, but a lot of the coastline is very variegated and hilly, and then there are towns and such, and inland there's agriculture. But right near Gothenburg, you have a tremendous display of these kind of rocky islands, which again, similar to Norway, meant that nobody could really get in there and without a local guide or a welcome. And even Gothenburg is well protected by its offshore islands. But it was always the access point to go out to the bigger sea, the North Sea, to go trading with Netherlands or Britain or beyond in the world, or with Norway. And so this is just such a dramatic part of the world. This is not Norway. This is actually northern Sweden on the eastern side of the great flat-topped glaciers that cover much of the mountains of central Scandinavia. And we've also come now through the Øresund, which is the sound water passage between Denmark and Sweden. And so this is the site of one of the world's largest tunnel bridge assemblies that unified this area so that now there's high-speed rail and traffic right over into Sweden and into Denmark. There's other high-speed rails that now are going down into Germany, so that this part of the world is no longer far or isolated by the waters and the terrain. On the Danish side of the Kattegat, you get a lot of this kind of sandy beaches. So that's the other side, just across from Gothenburg. Looks like a summer resort area, rather than the rocky islands that is Gothenburg. So this is the city, and you can see that there's a marked channel. We get into the major harbor, but the city is actually spread up the Gotha River, and there are many industrial parts and residential parts, and then that center city, which has the ancient buildings and some of the fortresses that characterize the harbor when it had to defend itself. Though Sweden hasn't had a war in over 200 years, so they're counting their blessings that way. But as we sail into Gothenburg, you can see this old fortification. You come into the major harbor. We will be at a cruise terminal, and then there's shuttle bus and tour buses that will come and take us to our various sites. There are many interesting places around Gothenburg, particularly historic castles and things. But if you're on your own, you can just go to the central square where the terminus of the shuttle bus is and walk around and see the different classic buildings, the city hall, and then the Domkirke, which is the cathedral, a Lutheran cathedral. And there's a lot of small walking streets that are full of shops and cafes and things like this, right off the harbor area. But the city spreads out into the countryside. There are beautiful parks, and this is a big winter garden, a palm court they call it. And other buildings are characteristic. This is an old fishing market that has this very triangular look to it, and now it's used as a dining hall and an event space. And in the suburbs, they also have one of the amusement park. This is a Liseberg Park, which is sort of like a Tivoli. If you were in Copenhagen, went to see the great original amusement park. This is similar, the Liseberg Park. And there's just a lot of fun, especially in the summer. The Swedes are an industrious people. They endure a long winter, and they do their work and study and stay indoors. And then they come out to play all summer. There's a big midsummer festival, which I once went to when I was living in Sweden. And everybody stays up for days at midsummer when the sun is out almost all day. And they sing and carry on. And I went actually to a kräftorfest, which is crayfish. They actually would go out and catch crayfish in the rivers, and they have a big, like a gumbo dish, like in Louisiana, of their local little critters, sort of like tiny lobsters. And then they can top it off with all kinds of drinks, but especially, you may have seen this specialty of Sweden, which is the cinnamon bun. And that was invented in Sweden. So you got to thank them for something here. But in Gothenburg itself, there's a lot of education, technological companies. This is the Chalmers Technical University, where I've actually had some work done because I'm working in marine propulsion systems myself. And this is expertise that is world famous. Other industries around here are the Saab automobile, airplane factories. Volvo cars are made here. IKEA started here. Spotify, all these brands that we know around the world are actually many of them coming out of Gothenburg or Malmö or Stockholm, which are not very far away. So the educational level is so high that they continue to have many technological breakthroughs around the world. And this has made Gothenburg a pretty prosperous and modernized town. So beyond the historic center, there are all these new developments of the Gothic towers, and this is the newest one, just opened, called the Karla Tornet, named the Karl Tower after the king, who is still there. And so Gothenburg has this, it's always been, let's say, the working and innovative part of Sweden. And they have this park they've called the Way Out West, meaning if you get to the west coast of Sweden, from all the north and east parts, you're facing the world, and there's a big world out there to be involved with. I mean, much of Sweden is very rural or else wilderness. There are about 10 million people in the whole country, but the country is so large makes it has the least population density of any nation in Europe, except for its neighbor Norway. Well, this has a long history. In prehistory, people had settled all the way to the far Arctic north, but they gathered and began to have written language and then an identity earlier than this particular map, because there were small groups all through the area. The word Swedish itself comes from an Old Norse se, which is the word for we. And so it was like many people, they call themselves we are the people. But they were the different groups got together and formed larger trading networks. And then the longboat and the invention of the ship was the great catalyst for the extension of the Scandinavian culture, which we call of that era about 1,000 or more years ago, the Viking era. Now, the Vikings are a general term for the many peoples all around Scandinavia who then went raiding and trading. I'll put it that way. But they would call it actually as a verb. The verb is Viking. Vik is actually a bay or a piece of water, and to go Viking, like running or walking, it's a verb. We still use it in English, descended from the Old Norse, but they were remarkable people, strong and capable and daring, and they spread all through Northern Europe and all the way Russia, Iceland, Greenland, down to Vinland, which maybe was Newfoundland, now Canada, all the way to the Mediterranean and the Black Sea and the Bosphorus and the Caspian. So this is one of the more remarkable things. They were very few people, but they would sail and row, and then they'd drag their longboats over the hills to get to the next river, and then either pillage or trade, whichever it was. But why they were so strong is because not only just the boats and their daring do. Sweden is famous for its metallurgy. So that up in central Sweden, there's some very accessible iron and also copper mines to this day. And the metal work of the Viking era is remarkable, like this helmet that was found in central Sweden. And it goes on today to the industrial productions of Sweden today. At later Middle Ages, Gustav Vasa, who was a leader of his local group around Stockholm, refused to join with the Danish crown. They declared the independence of Sweden at the time, and then established a stronger navy, and that no longer longboats. Now this is almost 1,000 years later than the earliest Vikings, but the Swedish crown annexed and took over much of the Baltic, including what is now Finland, parts of eastern Russia, Estonia, Latvia, even down to areas that are now in Germany and Denmark. So this was the great extent of the Swedish crown and its absolute power. And Gustav Adolf, he won this battle in 1631 and beat the combined German forces in the area of now Poland. But he also founded the city of Gothenburg to be the stronghold fortress royal capital on the west coast of Sweden, facing out into the North Sea. And this is the great castle that he built, which we'll go see in Gothenburg. Kind of a round out tower so that it'd be difficult to bombard it with cannons, and then an overlook of the old harbor. Of course, it's much filled in and there's a big city around it. But this is sort of an example of the, let's say, the lack of modesty of the Swedish crown is quite well known. It's called the Lion of the North. And it continued to battle all around its forces. The problem back then is they didn't have a large population, so they had to be particularly strategic and capable and well armed to beat larger forces. And then they finally met their overmatch, the Russians, at the Battle of Poltava in 1709, where Gustav Adolfo was actually killed and the army had to flee. And so from then on, the overseas possessions of the Swedes retreated to what is now Sweden. Later, they did have colonies. For instance, anybody been to the state of Delaware in the United States? That was the original Swedish colony in the Americas. And they had trading posts around the world, but no territory to speak of. But nonetheless, the royal family continues. The House of Vasa, it's called, has been going on since the Middle Ages. It's one of the older houses that has a completely clear lineage, and a modest symbol of more lions and crowns and jewels and whatever else is in that particular emblem. And here is the current king, König Carl Gustaf the 16th. And he looks like he's surprised to be told he no longer has an empire and he must be a constitutional monarch. He's the leader of the country with ceremonial powers, which is that's a good thing in some countries. But he has his own palace in Gothenburg, a very modest little one compared to the big one in Stockholm and his other places around. But Gothenburg is a royal city. They were proud that they were founded by the original Adolphus. And this is the symbol of Gothenburg with the royal lion and the three crowns is the symbol of the authority of the king in other parts of the whole country. But the problem in many of these centuries is that because of the cold weather and then either invasions or plague and such, the countryside people were often very poor subsistence and were subject to famine, disease, and this led to a depopulation in the 1800s into the 1900s of immigrants going to North America, all through Canada, northern, Midwest United States, and they would leave, come down to Gothenburg and get on a Swedish American line or other commercial lines that would take them over in passage and become immigrants. So this led one writer to call Sweden, along with Norway, the haunted lands, because they have ancient mythology, old war scars and memories and myths and such, but they often had such a hard life that they left and it all became nostalgia. And so Sweden, like Norway, has many expatriate communities, but the ones who stayed were industrious and inventive, let's say. And here's another favorite son of Gothenburg, Alfred Nobel, who was an engineer who famously invented dynamite. Thank you very much. And in his conscience, he decided, well, if I invented this powerful explosive which has transformed the world in its explosive ways, at least he could leave his fortune to give a prize for peace and other scientific research. So he was the founder of the Nobel Prize, given out by the King of Sweden as an international prize. And meanwhile, the technology of Sweden continued on, and supposedly Sweden has the most patents for scientific research per capita of any place in the world. Of course, they only have a population of about 10 million, but what they do is so specialized it's remained leading edge in many technologies. This is one of the most critical, which is the ball bearing. The metallurgical abilities of the Swedish engineers meant that they were the most capable and valuable of these mechanical ball bearings, which are part of every machine. And of course, there's many varieties of them made around the world, but the best ones are still made in Sweden, supposedly. And then on the other side, the cultural life of Sweden is very, let's say, deep and sometimes dark and psychological. Most famously, the great author, playwright August Strindberg was a leading writer in modern theater to this day. He studied. And then they have other sports heroes like Björn Borg, the great tennis player, or everybody knows this group, ABBA, which is heard on this stage, on this ship, every cruise sometimes. And but they alone were an industry to themselves. They, along with their following colleagues who invented Spotify and all these other streaming music things, they brought a lot of income to Sweden just because of the musical and technical abilities. So that the life here now is at one of the highest per capita standards in the world. They also have a high tax burden. Up to 52% of your income goes to the government, local and national, but that also provides universal health care, universal education all the way through graduate school, and then many subsidies, and then a generally healthy environment above all, positive feelings for the community. And they have fun in the summer, particularly. This is just in the Gothenburg harbor. Everybody seems to have their own sailboat, and hopefully it's sunny enough to enjoy it. And then another thing we've been seeing on our trip is more and more of these great windmills. And so all the way up on the Öresund and up to Gothenburg area, you'll see all kinds of these gigantic windmills, which are now providing a lot of electricity for Sweden and Denmark. Neither country has oil and gas reserves, so this is the great transformation, so they can be self-sufficient from the world petroleum problems and such. But they have other concerns these days. Sweden has never been invaded because of this topography, meaning there are islands and channels and places, and so even the Danes, when they tried to invade, they couldn't find their way, or they were beaten back readily. So Sweden has a unique nature of its cities never having been attacked or bombed. And this is of concern because of the Russian aggression and war in Ukraine. They have, the Russian Kremlin and Putin himself says the next ones to be taken back into the new Russian Empire are Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and maybe Poland. But this has meant that Sweden and Finland have joined NATO after decades of saying we are neutral. And so, unfortunately, Sweden is arming itself for defenses, and particularly on the water. These are the new Swedish fast corvette missile carriers that can go at a speed beyond any other boat, we think, of this size. But they can go zipping around these islands and be stealth and have electronic warfare plus missilery. So they figure this is going to keep the Russian bear at bay. But they're out there practicing, mostly, of course, on the Baltic side, but all the way up in the West Coast, too, practicing these sort of recreational activities. And then in Gothenburg, again, as the leading aviation manufacturing, this is the Griffin fighter, one of the most advanced in the world, that are now, again, being mobilized and trained to guard the airspace all the way up to the Arctic. So this is the unfortunate fate of our times, because Sweden was always proud of its neutrality, it didn't even get into World War II, and did not want to get involved in the great power disputes of the modern age, but they've ended up joining the European Union. They still keep their kroner, they're not a Euro nation, and then now they've joined NATO, which my Swedish friends say they are, let's say, they understand, but they have a hesitation to want to be part of the world's military problems. But if you're not prepared, the worst can happen. But just for Gothenburg, you have this great harbor, very secure from the outside sea, a beautiful downtown with classic and modern buildings and some historic vessels. But a few years, a decade ago, they rebuilt their famous East India trader that would go from China and India all the way to Sweden, and it's named the Gothenburg. So it is actually going out around the world these days. A rather beautiful ship, but I don't think they have room service. And the symbol of Gothenburg is the royal lion, which is the carving figurehead on the bow of that great ship. And here it is coming into Gothenburg Harbor a few years ago. And so this is a maritime center that is proud of its tradition and its future. And this is the future, which is the new Candela all-electric hydrofoiling speeding ferry boat, which they're testing. I actually went on one recently just to examine its capabilities. And it can go 30, 40 miles an hour without a wake, which is perfect in all of these secluded little calm waters. I don't know if it could go out to sea, but they're building various of them, and it may appear in a harbor near you someday. So Gothenburg's a very capable and happy place, especially in the in the high summer and then in the evening, and we'll be there to enjoy some of the local nightlife if we stay there long enough, and then hail Poseidon, the statue at the entrance to the harbor. So I wish you a great trip visit in Gothenburg and a great trip on this beautiful ship all the way to Norway and back. And I hope to see you around the ship, and bon voyage.